All right, so before we get into Proverbs 25, you may have noticed last week and the week before, like the last several weeks, things have been changing around a lot. And it's been interesting. So I just copied and pasted a couple things just to kind of read them to you guys. Because tonight, the first verse mentions, it says, these also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. And that's kind of a little bit different from what we're used to seeing in the book of Proverbs. We're used to Solomon, and we're used to him talking to his kids, and we're used to, all this stuff that he presented. And now, interesting enough, King Hezekiah, king of Judah, some 270 years later, basically dug up these Proverbs from Solomon, transcribed them, and then added them to the book, which is really interesting. So I just kind of found some general information just to kind of share with you guys, where this part of the book is attributed to that, of King Hezekiah's men finding these things and putting them in the book of Proverbs. But then once we get closer to the end, we don't know who wrote some of this stuff. The last chapter, the poem about that magnificent woman, there's not really an author named for that. And it's pretty interesting. So the last section that we just finished last week was called The Words of the Wise. It was wise sayings. It was kind of generalized wise sayings, and it was attributed to Solomon compiling those together from various sources. And then, and then now we're getting into Proverbs, to wise sayings, more wise sayings of Solomon, but found by Hezekiah's men, or which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. So, can you mute number 2, the mute group? I don't know if you could hear that, but my guitar was. Yeah, it was still singing, huh? Oh, okay. So instead of me going through all this stuff, let's just go ahead and go into it. I talk a little bit about like the time frame here, because obviously King Hezekiah was way after the fact. And so let's just go into Proverbs 25. We'll start with verse 1 like we just read, and then we'll just work our way through the end of the chapter. We got 28 verses tonight. Some of them are really interesting. A lot of poetic stuff this week, which is cool. So 25 verse 1 says, "These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed." So these are more Proverbs from Solomon, but they were collected and transcribed under the reign of King Hezekiah. And what's interesting is the next 4 chapters will actually be part of this collection. Now, interesting is that these were gathered and transcribed something like 270 years later, after King Solomon had already died, obviously, which is interesting because my mind starts to race about how they, dug this stuff up, and it must have been really cool to find that. But the book of 1 Kings said that Solomon told something like, or said that he told 3,000 proverbs, and his songs are numbered at 1,005. And maybe that goes into why in a couple verses earlier in 1 Kings, it says, "Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all other people." I don't have 3,000 proverbs that I wrote. Think about how, especially, you're talking about hundreds of years BC, think about how profound that must have been, to have this collection of these wise sayings that were, godly wisdom, and his songs were numbered at 1,005. It's awesome. So King Hezekiah of Judah, he reigned during a time of revival in Israel. He was considered a good king. It was a spiritual revival in Israel, and he was considered a good king because he served God. If you remember back in our study of the 12 minor prophets, there were good kings and there were some kind of lousy kings. So he was considered a good king. And he added these chapters to the previous collection of Proverbs that were attributed to Solomon, and he added these in there. Hezekiah is the king that reestablished the temple of Solomon that was built in Jerusalem. And as far as we can tell, King Hezekiah's officials basically kind of found some more Proverbs. Maybe it was, some of the 3,000. They just, look what I found. So they added these Proverbs to Solomon's book, and Solomon either wrote these Proverbs directly, or it's possible they were part of his collection. He tended to collect wise sayings and hold on to them. So it's possible he wrote them. It's possible that he's just collecting them. But regardless, they are wise sayings, godly sayings. So let's get right into it. That's the short introduction of this chapter, of this section, is just simply King Hezekiah's men found these and transcribed them and put them in the book. So the first 7 verses in chapter 25 start off by talking about kings. So we're going to get into some kingly stuff here. Starting with verse 2, it said, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter." So there's a lot of things in this world that we don't know, and that goes without saying. But we're able to search out matters, and we're able to look for answers. But there are things that we'll simply never understand. And there's things that we can't understand. There are things that God has concealed in his wisdom. This says that it's the glory of God to conceal a matter. We always often talk about the mysteries of God. But that tells us that everything you can see is so amazing, or if everything you see is so amazing, because we can look at something like the sunset and see how intricate and complex that is. If everything that we see is so amazing and it points to God's glory, imagine the stuff that you can't see. It's got to be so much more bigger than that. It reminds me of what Paul wrote when he said, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known." If everything that we know and we see in this world is like looking in a dim mirror, that should tell you the amazing things that God's got in this existence. But also, Paul wrote this in Romans. He said, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so they are without excuse." So we see evidence of God all around us. But it's also the glory of kings to search for things as well. So it's God's glory to hide things that are bigger than us, or things that he deems that we don't need to know about. But it's the glory of kings to search out things. Now, what this is talking about is when kings seek out knowledge, maybe by using science or something like that to try to understand these things that God has concealed, there's glory in that. When you're seeking intelligence, when you're seeking to find things like that. So it seems like verses like this might even be showing that kings like Solomon or kings like Hezekiah are looked at as scholar kings. There's glory in that. It shows that the academic side of it and the governmental power were closely intertwined back then. You don't see kings now writing things and keeping poetry and writing songs and proverbs. So this proverb seems to highlight that a king is thought of as being great if he's able to understand mysteries in the world and seek these things out and look into scientific discoveries and things like that. There's glory behind that. Verse 3, "As the heavens for height and the earth for depth, so the heart of kings is unsearchable." Now this is kind of an interesting verse because it shows that we don't really personally know people in positions of power, which is why when they're campaigning for something, they get questioned a lot. They're supposed to have press conferences, and they're supposed to go up in front of people because people want to get to know them in a way. If they're going to lead, people should try to get to know them. Ultimately, what this is getting at is that you can't really know a king's emotions or secrets or their thoughts. In public, the king might act a certain way. He might go in front and be a very kingly person. But in a more private setting, he might be completely different. His personality might be completely different. He could be bold and tough in front of people when he's kingly, but then when he's by himself, he might be kind of timid and quiet, completely different. Not to mention that the king is trusted with really sensitive information and a lot of power and resources and stuff like that common man wouldn't even know what to do with. They have a huge responsibility. Verses 4 and 5. This is a cool verse here. "Take away the impurities from the silver, and there comes out a vessel for the smith. Take away the wicked before the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness." So this is a cool kind of poetic way of saying that just like the impurities should be taken away from the silver, wicked should be taken away from the king. Wickedness should be taken away from the king. And by doing that, it's going to allow the king's leadership, their throne, as this verse says, to be established in righteousness. And it's a really simple proverb if you think about it, because if you just look at it this way, if the smith does not remove impurities from silver, how is he going to make some sort of nice jewelry out of it? It's not going to look nice. Likewise, from a kingly perspective, how can a king rule properly if there's evil around him? A king cannot properly rule if his government is evil. Pretty interesting, cool verse, couple verses there. Then verses 6 and 7, the last couple about kings here, it says, "Do not boast in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the same place as great people. For it is better that it be said to you, 'Come up here,' than for you to be placed lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen." So first of all, pretty obvious for us that boasting is not a good thing. You shouldn't be prideful. You shouldn't boast. We're called to be humble. Believers are supposed to be humble. Jesus said, "Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted." In the book of James, it says, "Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you." It's just like what this verse is saying, but it's putting it in more of a worldly perspective. When a person properly humbles themselves in front of God or in front of kings, they might be invited up to a higher place. Just like what Jesus said, the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So it's better that it's said to you, "Come up here." Being invited up because of your humility. Again, going back to Jesus' words, he says, whenever you're invited, go and take the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up higher." And then you will have honor in the sight of all who are dining at the table with you. It's not good for you to be like, "Yeah, I deserve to be at the front table. That's where I need to be." It's different to be humble and kind of sit in the back and for them to go, "Oh, Yvonne, you're supposed to be up here, dude. Come up here." There's a difference there. Okay, so now we're going to focus on some stuff that's not kingly anymore. So verses 8 to 10. It says, "Do not go out hastily to argue your case. Otherwise, what will you do in the end when your neighbor humiliates you? Argue your case with your neighbor, and do not reveal the secret of another, or one who hears it will put you to shame, and the evil report about you will not pass away." So it's kind of a lot of words to basically say not everything needs to be such a big deal, and you can handle it kind of outside of court, and you don't need to be putting other people's business out there, basically. But sometimes it is important to get the court involved. If you're looking at like a big deal, obviously you want to get the law involved with that. But this says, "Do not go out hastily to argue your case." If it's possible to resolve some sort of a dispute or argument or whatever it is in pretty much any other way, you should probably do it in that other way. It's just easier. And Paul actually wrote about this in his letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians. He says, "Does any one of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare to go to the law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you not competent from the smallest law courts? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more matters of this life? So if you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them as judges who are of no account in the church? I say this to your shame. It is so that there is not among you anyone wise who will be able to decide between his brothers and sisters, but brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers." Sorry, long several verses here. "Actually then, it's already a defeat for you that if you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather suffer the wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? On the contrary, you yourselves do wrong and defraud, and this to your brothers and sisters." So that was a long quote there from 1 Corinthians. But basically, it's just saying to avoid all that kind of conflict. You don't need to go through all that kind of conflict. And even in this proverb, it says, "One who hears you will put you to shame. Do not reveal the secret of another." Another reason to avoid court and making this public is because you might be put to shame. Your reputation might be on the line. There's plenty of people that hastily go to court without any kind of realistic confidence that they're even going to win. There's a lot of people that want to just jump to that and make a big deal out of everything. All of these verses are basically saying it's better to settle out of court. If you can debate your case outside of court, then do it there. You don't need to involve a bunch of people. You don't need to make a big spectacle out of it. You don't need to make a big deal out of it. Just settle your debate outside of court, and that's good enough. Now, for the rest of these chapters, we're going to go back to that more simple format of just the one or two verses and kind of hit them one by one. And it's interesting because we haven't been there in a few weeks, and now we're going to go back to the one by one. And it's kind of funny. But this is when we get into the poetic stuff here, which is really cool. So starting with verse 11, it says, like apples of gold and settings of silver is a word spoken at the proper time. These are like the Proverbs, like what you think Proverbs are. But basically this verse is saying the right word at the right time can be a powerful thing. We've talked about having the right words to say. You can encourage somebody, you can help somebody, you can build somebody up, you can guide them, you can lead them, and so many other different positive things if you have the right word at the right time. Like an apple made of gold that's set on a beautiful silver platter, which is a really interesting poetic depiction of that. Because right words, correct words, encouraging words are beautiful. They're like gold. Right words, correct words are valuable, like silver. But what's interesting too is those correct words at the correct time, they also, you can look at them as being rare, like silver and like gold. Valuable. And then the next verse continues along this kind of same line of thought here. Verse 12, it says, like an earring of gold and a jewelry piece of fine gold is a wise person who offers rebukes to a listening ear. So a right word spoken at the right time could be a rebuke. You could be correcting them. And when a wise person who speaks a right word at the right time has the proper listener, has somebody that's actually going to listen to them, that's like fine jewelry. That's a good thing. It's good when somebody actually listens to a rebuke. We've talked about the importance of discipline and accepting course correction. A lot of people don't like course correction. They don't like to be told they're wrong. They don't like that. They don't like when things are pointed out like that, but it's important. It's important to receive constructive criticism. It's called correction for a reason. It's constructive criticism. It's correct. It corrects our behavior. And listening to wise correction is good. And it's mutually beneficial too, which is cool, because the wise person gets to have the satisfaction of helping somebody, and they get to right a wrong, they get to correct something, and then the person that listens gets to grow, and they get to learn, and they get to correct their behavior and act correctly. So it's good both ways. So you can see why that's like fine jewelry. Verse 13. Another interesting one here. Actually, almost all of these for the rest of the chapter are really interesting. It says, like the cold of snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, for he refreshes the soul of his masters. So your verse or your translation might actually mention a drink. This verse is understood to be talking about a cold drink that is actually cooled by the snow. The NIV translation actually says, like a snow-cooled drink at harvest time is a trustworthy messenger to the one who sends him. He refreshes the spirit of his master. So this whole verse here is meant to depict like a nice, cool, refreshing drink when you've been working hard and sweating all day. Have you guys ever had that where you get that water bottle that you put in the freezer and it just started to freeze a little bit and you were out doing yard work or something? I love cold water. So that's what this is kind of talking about. That refreshment that you get from drinking a nice, cool drink, that's synonymous with the blessing of a faithful messenger. The faithful messenger is refreshing to the person that sent that message, to their soul. Even if you look at this verse without the drink, because some translations don't mention a drink, because New American Standard just says, like the cold snow, even without the drink, it still makes sense, because this verse is not talking about snowing during harvest time. It's talking about how during the hot summers, laborers would actually bring snow and ice from the high mountains, and then they would store them. They would store the snow in houses, and they would store it in these snow caves. And they would bring down snow from the mountains during the heat of harvest, and they would use that snow to bring refreshment to the workers and cool their drinks. But what's really cool about this verse is if a faithful messenger is that refreshing to a person that sends them out, think about it this way. God wants his people to be faithful messengers of his gospel and faithful messengers of his work. So if the sender of a message is refreshed and comforted by knowing that the message that he sent is being faithfully delivered, we can see how applying this proverb to the Great Commission shows that God is pleased with his faithful messengers that deliver his message. Isn't that awesome? If you go out and you're sharing that message, you know, I don't know about you guys, but when I feel the Holy Spirit really moving, I get goosebumps. If I'm having a conversation talking about God, boom, I get goosebumps. And I just know instantly that's the Holy Spirit right there. Imagine knowing that in those conversations, when you're sharing the gospel with somebody, that God is refreshed from that, that he's pleased with that, like a cold drink on a hot day. That is such a cool depiction. Again, these verses are so poetic. All right, verse 14. Like clouds and wind without rain is a person who boasts of his gifts falsely. The word gifts there is like actual gifts, like presents. Another interesting verse here. So we already know this about Israel, but Solomon lived in a dry country. And rain was a very important aspect of their lives. Rain was life-giving in a way because of how much they relied on their agriculture. So you can imagine people were probably stressed out when there wasn't any rain. A person that boasts of his gifts falsely is like clouds without rain. Because he didn't do the things that he promised. Just as much as you look at the clouds and you expect them to rain, if they don't rain, you're disappointed. So, Don, I've got so many birthday presents for you, dude. And then I don't give them to you, you're going to be disappointed. Even though whoever made these promises might have seemed to be genuine, think about when it's really dark and it's really cloudy and you're looking up there and you're like, it's going to rain. Like, I can tell it's going to rain. My kids always, that's a storm. There's a thunderstorm. Like, there's not all thunderstorms. But when that rain doesn't come, it almost doesn't seem right. When you have those real dark, heavy clouds and there's no rain, it's disappointing. Like, what happened to this person that boasts of these gifts, these presents? He didn't give the gifts that he promised. And there are some people that don't give anything, but then want to be known as a giver. They want to give off the appearance of being generous without even giving anybody anything. And there's people that only give small things. And they want to be known as somebody that gives really big gifts. They want the reputation of generosity without actually being generous. And you can imagine that disappointment that comes with that. It's just like expecting rain, needing it even, and then not getting it. When the clouds and the wind of a storm come, people depend on it and they expect it. And when the clouds and wind don't bring rain, it's a disappointment, just like the person that boasts of giving falsely. The book of James says, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear either by heaven or earth or with any other oath, but your yes is to be yes and your no, no, so that you do not fall under judgment. If I'm going to go out and boast that I'm going to give people gifts or whatever it is, I better follow through with it, because I'm going to disappoint a lot of people. It reminds me of kind of a funny way to put it is if you guys ever saw The Office, in the TV show The Office, the manager of this paper branch promised a bunch of little kids that he was going to pay for them to go to college if they graduate high school, and then he forgot about it. And then all of the kids graduated high school, and they were like, and they were celebrating so happy that he was going to pay for their college, and instead he gave them laptop batteries because that's all he had. So that disappointment there, you can see. Anyway, verse 15 says, through patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks bone. Now, another super interesting verse, because right off the bat here, that second line is interesting. A gentle tongue breaks bone. It has gentleness with the strength of breaking bone. So we'll get to that in a second, but this is showing that self-control and patience are really important, powerful things. In fact, they can persuade the powerful. It says a ruler may be persuaded through patience. The patient, gentle words of a wise person can actually have a huge impact, even if that impact is spread out over a long period of time. Patience. This verse describes it as breaking bone. And one commentary I read about that, it says, it points out that a gentle tongue breaking bone might seem like a paradox, but it is a fine illustration of the power of gentleness above hardness and irritation, which is a great point. But it shows that a patient person can achieve great things, and that even though he has a gentle tongue, there's power behind that. Enough power. It describes this as breaking bone. It shows you how important and powerful your words can actually be through patience. Verse 16 is another great verse. Have you found honey? Eat only what you need so that you do not have it in excess and vomit it. Fantastic proverb. We keep seeing these poetic verses tonight, but put plain and simple, this verse, honey is good, but too much of it's going to make you sick. Think of honey as anything good, just something good. Honey should be enjoyed because it's good, it's tasty, but you should only eat as much as you need. You eat too much, you'll get sick. If something good is eaten beyond what is needed, if you overindulge in it, if you have it in excess, if you fill yourself with it, you're going to cause a negative reaction. It's going to make you throw up. You can look at it as losing that good thing that you thought you gained. It says if you find honey, you're like, oh, I found honey, and then you eat it until you throw it up, that's a waste of honey. Overindulgence, even in good things, can become harmful and counterproductive. You ever hear that figure of speech, everything in moderation? This is kind of what this is talking about. Too much of something, even if it is a good something, can have negative repercussions. I forget that every time I open up Chips Ahoy cookies and get a glass of milk, because I'll eat half the package and then I regret it. But it was good at first. Overindulgence. Sherry. Verse 17. Now this is an interesting verse here, huh? Verse 17, it says, let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will become weary of you and hate you. Now, again, super interesting verse here. This is less about the neighbor and more talking about the abuse of his hospitality is what this is getting at here. Because neighbors should be neighborly. But if someone's taking advantage or abusing that neighborliness, it's going to lead to problems. You should be able to be kind, and you should be able to kind of read between the lines with your neighbor too. Be empathetic about it. You should be able to see it before it even gets out of hand. A neighbor may become exhausted from their neighbor if they're taking advantage of them. Since good neighborly relationships make life better and they're beneficial to have, it's an important principle of wisdom here. This is just simple verse. Think about this verse following that last verse too. We just talked about overindulgence and how it can make you sick. Honey is good, but too much honey will make you sick. Friendship is good, and visits to your neighbor are good. But too many visits to your neighbor and too often might make them sick of you. Might upset your neighbor. Again, too much of a good thing turns bad. Everything in moderation, including taking hospitality. You know, sometimes it requires a little bit of discernment, you know? Yeah, well, okay. Verse 18. Like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow is a person who gives false testimony against his neighbor. Now, first of all, there's another verse that kind of mirrors this. In Exodus and the Ten Commandments, it says flat out, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Pretty plain and simple. But this proverb likens that breaking that 10th commandment, it likens it to violence almost. Not necessarily like we do nowadays, microaggressions or whatever you want to talk about. It's not like if somebody looks at me and says, hey, Kevin, you have crooked British teeth, and then I get mad and say, you physically hurt me and I have you arrested. That's not what we're talking about. Don't look at my teeth. But this is saying that a club or a sword or an arrow might hurt your neighbor, and so will a lie. So will false testimony. It can have very negative effects for that person. You know that saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? That's not really a true statement. Words can wound very deeply. It may not damage physically, but mentally and emotionally, and it can ruin your reputation. It can do a lot of damage. Words can do a lot of damage. A commentary I read says that false testimony is a cruel and pernicious, it says, false testimony is as cruel and pernicious to him as any instrument of death. The design of the proverb is to show the wickedness of slander, and that a false witness in some respect is as bad as a murderer. Because you can really destroy somebody's life. So don't do it. Verse 19. Like a bad tooth and an unsteady foot is confidence in a treacherous person in time of trouble. Now it's worded really weird in the New American Standard. It kind of goes with the last one, though. Looking at other translations of this verse will help you to understand it a little bit. Like I said, New American Standard's word kind of weird, but New King James words it like this. It says, confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint. So the person that gives false testimony, like we talked about in that last verse, is usually a person you don't have much confidence in. And a treacherous person, like this verse, is an unfaithful person. Closer to the Hebrew, it's a faithless man. Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like having a bad tooth or having a foot out of joint. A bad tooth causes pain, and it continues to cause pain. A foot out of joint causes pain, and it continues to cause pain. A faithless person will not help you in time of need. He will cause problems, and he will continue to cause problems. Or like this proverb says, he will cause pain like a bad tooth or like a dislocated foot. Verse 20. Like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, or like vinegar on soda, is one who sings songs to a troubled heart. Another really interesting verse here. And this verse is actually talking about being cruel to somebody or being completely oblivious to somebody else's sorrow and their pain. And it's interesting because at first, when you first read it, you're like, if somebody's sad, I want to sing them a song, and cheer them up. But that's not what this is talking about. This is warning against thoughtless reactions to someone's sorrow. Basically, it would be cruel to sing a song to somebody that's depressed and sad and sorrowful without considering what pain they're going through. And like I said, at first you can look at this as trying to make them feel better or something, but that's not what this is talking about. Singing a song is nice, maybe trying to cheer them up or whatever, but when someone's sad and they're really discouraged and they have a troubled heart, it's kind of wrong to assume that a simple song is going to make them feel better. Trying to comfort somebody with an overly simple measure is not only ineffective, but for some people it can be insulting. This proverb shows that going through it shows that by going through the examples at the beginning of this verse. Taking off a garment on a cold day. Obviously, if it's cold outside and you take somebody's jacket or you take your jacket off, you're going to get cold. You're going to be uncomfortable really quick. And vinegar on soda. The word translated soda, it's talking about soap. It's talking about like a cleansing agent, like carbonate of soda, or you can even think of it as baking soda, but it's meant to be like a soap. And when you pour vinegar on a soap, it's not soap anymore. You can't use it that way anymore. One commentary likened it to pouring vinegar on a wound even. Pouring acid on soap. The one who treats the heavy heart without sensitivity brings discomfort, brings irritation, brings agitation. Think of this as trying to make merry in the presence of sorrow. Have you ever been in a really bad mood or something and somebody's like, hey, come on, like, what's wrong? Yeah. It's kind of like that. You feel insulted, it bugs you. It's like playing that song, that song, 'cause I'm happy. You know that song? It's like playing that song at a funeral. You don't do that. And actually, I'm going to do it. I'm going to play it, but I won't play it on the video. There's this video that I got from TikTok, which is exactly what I just described. These guys are at it. It'd be kind of hard to see. So he's at a funeral, and he's sad. There's the family members being sad. And the DJ accidentally turned the wrong song on. That was hilarious. But that's kind of what it's talking about. That kind of makes you uncomfortable. It's what it's talking about. You just don't do that. Verses 21 and 22 says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. And if he's thirsty, give him water to drink. For you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Another super interesting verse. This one's a pretty famous proverb. There's so much good stuff in this chapter, by the way. But first of all, we're supposed to love others. We're supposed to be concerned with others, and that includes our enemies. We're supposed to love our enemies. And it's tough because naturally we want to go against our enemies, because that's our enemy. But Jesus said, he said, you have heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may prove yourselves to be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. We're called to love our enemies. But this verse says to be kind and to be empathetic toward your enemy, and by doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Now, what's interesting about this verse is commentators debate on whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Most of the time that I've heard it, it's typically kind of like almost in a vengeful way, like, I'll give you food and I'll give you drink, and by doing that, booyah, you're going to be convicted, you're going to feel bad, I'm going to heap burning coals on your head. And it's usually kind of a fighting back thing almost, like kill them with kindness kind of thing. But most people believe that this refers to conviction, and that our kindness places conviction on our enemy. If you're nice to your enemy, then they're going to feel bad, and that's equivalent to like dumping coals on their head. That burns like coals. It's super convicting to them because you were so nice to them. But there's a lot of people that actually think that this is speaking about the practice of lending coals from your fire to help your neighbor start their fire, which is a really interesting perspective. So if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink, and give him some coals so he can start a fire. Help him even further. Love your enemy even further. Some people look at it that way, which is really interesting. I've never heard it that way, actually. But however you interpret that, either way, you're destroying your enemy, which is really cool. You're getting rid of your enemy, whether through conviction or through becoming a friend. And the Lord will reward you. There's benefit in that. God sees that your actions are right, and God will reward you. Really cool couple verses there. Verse 23 says, the north wind brings rain, and a gossiping tongue brings an angry face. Really simple verse. Basically, the north wind blows and it brings rain, and those that gossip and talk trash about other people and with a gossiping tongue, you're going to get an angry face from other people. Just as much as storm clouds are going to bring rain, you're going to make somebody mad with gossip. It's just a simple matter of cause and effect, just like the north wind bringing rain. Very simple proverb, pretty self-explanatory. And then at verse 24 it's the same verse verbatim, but in a different chapter here. Same verse from chapter 21. It's better to live on the corner of a roof than in a house shared with a contentious wife or woman. We talked about it a few weeks ago, just thinking practically. First of all, the corner of the roof is not a nice place to live. And you can imagine it's got to be uncomfortable and small and kind of awkward, not to mention being exposed to the elements, whether it's the heat or whether it's the cold or rain or whatever. But this proverb is saying that is better than sharing a house with a contentious woman. Other translations call her a quarrelsome wife, a brawling wife, a nagging wife. Living with somebody that's constantly argumentative and combative, and it's a miserable existence. First of all, it's annoying, and second of all, it's exhausting, it's defeating, it's miserable. But this proverb explicitly, although this proverb explicitly says a contentious woman, a nagging wife, you can very easily see the pendulum swinging the other direction. It goes both ways. Constant conflict is terrible for whoever's involved in it. It's better to live in an uncomfortable and inconvenient living situation than it is to deal with that. It's better to be inconvenienced and uncomfortable but have peace at home than it is to have no peace at home but then be living in a different circumstance. It's worth noting too, later on Proverbs says, or earlier it says, Earlier Proverbs say, a gracious woman attains honor, and it says an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, a prudent wife is from the Lord. There's a lot of wonderful, good things that come from marriage and spouses, and we talked about these things. Marriage is wonderful, spouses are wonderful, but when there's constant bickering and fighting and nagging and arguing, it brings something else into that marriage. And Proverbs says that the quarrels of a wife are a constant dripping. You can say the quarrels of your spouse are like a constant dripping. But ultimately, and the same way I closed it last time, is we have to remember that marriage is a two-way street and that both sides need to give. They need to give what they want to get. So, verse 25. This one's similar to that one earlier about refreshing cold drink. It says, like cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a distant land. When a person is weary, like this verse says, cold water is refreshing, a cold drink. And the word soul in this proverb is used in the same sense as other proverbs, saying that it's a reference to their whole life, not necessarily the inner spiritual soul, but it's good for their well-being. When we receive good news is like refreshing water. It's awesome. And this is not speaking of the gospel specifically, but you can apply it to the gospel message too, which is really cool, which shows you that these proverbs are true. It applies to all kinds of good news, whatever that good news may be. The fact that somebody travels from a far country to deliver good news shows us how important that good news is. And when you receive that good news, it's refreshing. And like I said, you can apply that to the gospel message too. Sharing that gospel message is refreshing. Now, I wanted to share real quick something that happened to me in my life where I got to witness this in real life. I went to Mazatlan on a mission trip, and I was walking around Carnival with a guitar, singing worship songs in the middle of this giant party. And this one guy came up to me, and he was like, "What are you guys doing?" And we said, we're singing worship music and praying with people, talking to people. And he's like, "You play music?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "What kind of music?" I said, "Jesus Christo." And he said, he's like, "Play me a song." I was like, "Okay." So I played Lead Me to the Cross. And he thanked me for it. And he said, "That's awesome." And then he was talking to us, and he's like, "Why are you doing this?" And I remember I said, "It's important." And he was touched by it. And he said he hadn't gone to church in a long time. He needed to work on that relationship. He wanted to get his family back into church and stuff. And it wound up being this witnessing moment. But I loved that he said, "Why are you doing this?" He was so confused. Why would people come from America, come here during a giant party where everybody's drunk and wasted, and you're in the middle of this, and you're playing Jesus music and witnessing to people and praying with people? Why are you doing that? He was confused. And I don't know what made me think of it. And this is the first time I've ever seen, like a practical application of that response, but it's important. It is. It was important. And that's what you see. This proverb played out in real life. Like cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a distant land. Verse 26. Like a trampled spring and a polluted well, so is a righteous person who gives way before the wicked. Another interesting verse. The New King James Version, again, kind of presents it a little bit easier to understand. Again, New American Standard is worded a little weird, but New King James Version says, "A righteous man who falters before the wicked is like a murky spring and a polluted well." And first of all, it shows that righteous people falter. We fall. We fail sometimes. We scrape our knees. But you can imagine that failure, that falter, becomes worse when a righteous man falters before the wicked, falters in front of the wicked, falters in the view of somebody that outright rejects God or rejects that godly lifestyle. And you can imagine that effect. Let's say I don't know, I got drunk or something in front of somebody that knows I'm a Christian and they are opposed to me being a Christian, they're like, oh, look at you, you're a hypocrite, you're doing this. They love to find that in believers. They love to point out hypocrisy in believers. But the reality is we fail. We fall sometimes. But what this is pointing out is dropping the ball in front of somebody that's already has their faith compromised or doesn't believe in God. You can see that problem there. You can see how it can have bigger effects. Instead of the clarity of clean and clear water like you would expect in a spring or in a well, a compromised life, making these kinds of mistakes, is like a trampled spring in a polluted well. It's murky. It's you don't want to drink that water. Verse 26, going back to honey here. It is not good to eat much honey, nor is it glory to search out one's own glory. Another interesting verse. We've already talked about eating too much honey. In Solomon's day, sweets were kind of a rarity. They were kind of special. Honey was something that was considered special, and nothing was really sweeter than honey. That was like the standard of sweetness was honey. But as we've talked about already, overindulgence in even a good thing like honey is not good. Self-control needs to be practiced even with good things. Which is interesting because you tend to let your guard down a little bit with good things because you're like, it's good. Nothing wrong with it. But it can be bad. So applying that to this proverb, glory can be a good thing. Glory is a good thing. Paul wrote this to the Romans. He said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Glory is a good thing. But to search out one's own glory is not good. Arguably, you can say that that's not even really glory at all. Just like this verse says. It says it's not good to eat much honey, nor is it glory to search out one's own glory. It's not even glory. We should seek God's glory and not worry about our own. Then we close tonight with verse 28. It says, like a city that is broken into and without walls, so is a person who has no self-control over his spirit. First of all, I mentioned it earlier tonight, self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. And without God, self-control is a very difficult thing. The world and our flesh and the devil, all those things come together to make self-control even more difficult to manage. And you can imagine a city without walls has no defense and is vulnerable to every attack. So you can see how a person with no self-control is like a city with no walls because they're vulnerable. Just like a city without walls that's broken into. The city has no security, no stability, and it can't really protect anything valuable in the city. And it shows you how costly a lack of self-control can be. If you imagine a city with no walls that's broken into, everything's vulnerable. If you lack self-control, you're vulnerable. When Solomon's workmen built a city, they would start by building walls around that city. They would keep the walls around there. The walls were important defenses, and they would help protect the city from attacks. Now, as believers, we need to learn discipline. We need to learn that self-control because discipline is like those city walls, helping to protect ourselves and giving us a defense. And with that, it's Proverbs chapter 25. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you, God, for your word. Thank you for giving Solomon these wise sayings. Thank you for Hezekiah and his men finding these wise sayings and putting them in the Bible, God, so that we can read them and learn from them. Thank you for the beautiful poetic language, God, that we get to decipher and see what your word is talking about, God. I love that your book of wisdom requires wisdom to discern what you're saying, God, and we can apply it 2,500 years ago to now, God. We see how real and alive your word is, and I just want to thank you for the opportunity to study it and grow close to you. I want to thank you for everybody that comes on Wednesday night because we get to spend time together and break bread together and egg salad sandwiches together, and I just want to thank you for how awesome you are, God, and giving us this place to worship and giving us this place to study and grow closer to you, God. I pray that you continue to bless us as we go out, continue to bless our church, God. Guide us and strengthen our faith, God, as always. We love you so much, and God, we trust you with everything. It's in your Son's name. Amen.